So welcome today. This is actually our last Hazak Monday educational program for the year. Our next big event is our end of the year celebration on May 20th, and I hope you are all signing up. You have until next Monday to sign up for the event on the 20th. So if you haven't signed up yet, you got 7 more days to sign up. And it should be a lot of fun. We've got 2 of our cantors coming. They're doing a musical program, not a religious program, a musical program, and the rabbis will be there, and we have an amazing lunch and prizes, and it should be a lot of fun. Today, just a preview, we've got Professor Fermaglich. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Actually, no, it's Fermaglich.
Fermaglich, okay. Who's going to be speaking with us basically about name changing in Jewish life. Followed by baseball and opera with Steve Cohen. And then we've got our Torah study at 12:45 today with Rabbi Leibowitz. And then a Great Decisions discussion group on the High Seas Treaty at 12:45. And we'll give more about that later. I just also mentioned our next Hazak Sunday walk is going to be on May 19th at 10 a.m. at Lake Balboa. And Cantor Barron will be joining us again on a mindfulness walk. If you're interested, please sign up in advance so we know who's coming and how many are coming. But I encourage you to sign up. It should be a nice experience, and Cantor Barron's looking forward to being with us again. We'll have a little more later after the first speaker about a new event coming up in June. We're going to have a skirball tour again, and Roz will be telling us about that after our first speaker. So with that, it is my pleasure, despite all the technical issues, to welcome our first speaker, Kirsten Fermaglich. Talking about too long, too foreign, too Jewish, anti-Semitism and name changing in New York City, 1917-1946. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University. Her most recent book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name-Changing in America, was awarded the Saul Wiener Book Prize by the American Jewish Historical Society in 2019. And from January 2022 through June 2023, she served as the National Archives Distinguished Fellow, tasked with studying anti-Semitism in the United States federal government. Professor Femaglich is also an author of American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, Early Holocaust Consciousness in Liberal America, and co-editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, in 2013. She currently serves on the board of the Association for Jewish Studies. We're really honored to have you with us today, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. I guess raise your hand if you can't hear me. I've actually never done this way where I've seen an audience, so it's actually really nice to be able to see everyone. I want to thank everyone at Valley Beth Shalom for having me, for inviting me to speak for you. Thank you to Joel Hyatt and to everybody who's doing all this work right now. And thank you all to you for being here. I hope it's a beautiful sunny day in Los Angeles, which probably is, rather than what it is here in Michigan, which is gray and cloudy. When I usually give talks, and actually I kind of have the chance to do this because I actually can see all of you now, which is kind of cool. I usually start off talks, or I used to start off talks when I gave them in person more, asking how many people had a story of name changing in their family, for example, and like have everybody raise their hand, Yeah, so okay, so somebody in the front definitely raising their hand. How many people know someone who changed a name, like in their family, friends experience, acquaintances, coworkers? How many people have read a book or seen a movie where there's been a character who's changed their name, or it's been sort of a subject of the film? So sometimes there's more hands up. So frequently, by the time I'm done, there's definitely a decent number of people who raise their hands when I ask those kinds of questions. And I really think it kind of points to the ways that name changing, even if we don't think about it all that much, certainly not as much as I've thought about it over the course of my career, I still think that name changing is a really integral part of American Jewish culture, and actually American culture more broadly. There's, even there's a lot of stories, personal stories. There's a lot of direct experience, but there's also a lot of anecdotes and jokes and folklore about name changing in American and American Jewish life. And I think that those anecdotes and jokes and pieces of folklore have really shaped our cultural understanding of what it means to change your name. So I'm going to start off, and that was true when I actually started my research. And so I want to start off this talk with a couple of anecdotes, jokes, stories about name changing that I think have really shaped our understanding and our thinking about name changing. That shaped my understanding, I think, even before I walked into the first archive to look at my first materials. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, which actually we probably should have practiced before I started, but let's see if that works. Can everybody see that now? Maybe raise your hand if you can see that. So I know, okay, great. And I'm going to do this so it turns on to a slideshow. So I'm going to start off with the first popular image. These are kind of popular images of name changing. So the first story comes from Edward G. Robinson's memoir, All My Yesterdays. An immigrant from Bucharest, Romania, Robinson changed his name from Emmanuel Goldenberg as an 18-year-old drama student. When he says, and this is in quotes, "It was suggested to me, ever so tactfully, that Emmanuel Goldenberg was not a name for an actor. Too long, too foreign, and I suspect too Jewish." And he says, although the thought of changing it was unpleasant, was somehow a denial of my beginning, somehow unfaithful to my mother and father and 5 brothers, he searched for a new American sounding name and adopted his middle initial G as, quote, my private treaty with the past. So that's one story. And if you don't know that story, I imagine you know other stories of movie stars changing their names. That's one of the most popular ways that we think about name changing, right? The second story is actually a famous joke. And sometimes I, sort of tell this joke when I'm actually in an audience and people can finish it for me. So see if you can do this, right? So a Jewish immigrant entered America at Ellis Island and was processed according to standard procedures. These were very confusing to him. He was overwhelmed by the noise and the bustle, very confused. And so when one of the officials asked him, "What is your name?" he replied, "I'm vergessen," in Yiddish. I've already forgotten, right? And so the official then recorded his name as Sean Ferguson, or Shane Ferguson, depending on how you know the joke. Um, and so I don't know if you know that particular joke, but maybe you do know that joke, or you know another Ellis Island joke, or maybe you have a story of an Ellis Island name change in your family. That's pretty common. And so I would sort of lump these together as ways of thinking about name changing in this particular kind of setting, with the picture of Ellis Island that we have here. And I'll come back to that. And the third story is actually a scene from the popular film Hester Street, a dramatization of the Abraham Cahan novel Jekyll. And I don't know, we could get a show of hands how many people have seen that movie. I see a few hands being raised from the 1970s. It's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. Jekyll so it comes from this dramatization of the Abraham Cahan novel Jekyll. It's quite faithful, actually. Jekyll is an immigrant who has been in the country for several years, and he's tried to shed his old world life completely, calling himself Jake. He prides himself on his Yankee clothes and his knowledge of American culture and English language. Upon the death of his father, he sends for his wife, played by Carol Kane. You can see her here, named Giddel, and his son, Yosela. But he's embarrassed of their greenhorn status, and he shuns his wife for a beautiful, more assimilated woman. And his wife, who you can see here, feels rejected and confused by this name change. And the difference between his name change and her experience of the United States is one of the crucial turning points of the film. So I don't know if you know these 3 specific stories, although people raise their hands with a few of them. So it sounds like at least 1 or 2 of them probably sound familiar to you. What I want to point out for you is although the stories are substantially different stories, they all share one crucial similarity. They all emphasize name changing as a profoundly individual activity, right? In the case of Edward G. Robinson and all tales of movie star name changes, the name change is the act of an extraordinary individual, someone who is distinguished by talent or beauty or charisma. Immigrant Sean Ferguson's name change, on the other hand, was the result of his profound isolation as an immigrant. His name was changed because he was a lonely individual who had no understanding of or connections to his new culture, and because he had no one to aid him in navigating the system. So finally, in Hester Street, name changing is identified with a shallow young man who wants to abandon his family, abandon his roots, abandon his culture, and remake himself entirely as an individual in the new world. All three of these stories share sort of the suggestion that name changing is an act that's entered into by individuals who are isolated or escaping from or betraying Jewish families and the Jewish community. And in contrast with these three really, I think, popular stories of individual name changing, which I think really shape the way we understand name changing in American popular culture, I'd like to offer you another, actually, probably more common story of name changing in America. Um, So in 1932, a man named Max Greenberger petitioned the city court of the city of New York to allow himself, as well as two of his four children, to change their last name to Green. And one of Greenberger's grounds for the petition was that the name Greenberger is a foreign sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician. Another ground was that, quote, the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing an appointment as intern in a hospital. That was the chosen profession of one of his sons. Um, and Greenberger's petition was one of thousands that was submitted in the middle of the 20th century to the New York City Civil Court. Men, women, and children like the Greenbergers legally changed their ethnic sounding names to less ethnically identifiable ones. Between 1930 and 1960 was the majority of them, but actually it happened, throughout much of the first part of the 20th century. And until the 1960s, Jewish names were represented disproportionately among the names being changed legally in New York City. Yet historians have not seriously studied the significance of name changing in American or American Jewish life. I'm going to sort of show you this. Scholars of American life have tended to take name changing for granted. They've tended to refer to its existence very casually. This person changed their name without really exploring it. This book, my book, which you can see there on the left hand side there, or my left. This book is really the first in-depth historical work to be written about any group changing their name in the United States. And you can see on the right there the petitions that I looked at, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And I think it's really a shame that more people haven't written about it. I'm hoping that my work actually kind of encourages more people to write about name changing, because I think that by exploring the practice of name changing in more depth, we can understand much more about the lives of American Jews. The fact that Max Greenberger was not a movie star and was not a young single man seeking to escape his Jewish past and succeed in an elite non-Jewish world, nor was he a hapless immigrant caught up by circumstances. Instead, he was a middle-aged father seeking to improve his family's economic status. I think this illustrates for us the degree to which name changing was a voluntary group activity for Jewish men, women, and children in the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century in New York City, name changing was a strategy of class mobility that Jewish families embraced in large numbers. And ironically, I'm going to argue that strategy illustrated Jews' economic comfort in the United States. The Greenberger children were not looking for manual labor, right? They're looking to be a doctor and a musician. So it illustrates some strength for American Jews in the American economy, but it also illustrated Jewish weakness. An identifiable Jewish name like Greenberger was, quote, not helpful to securing good employment. Um, and so ultimately, I'm going to argue for you, and I argue in my book, that name changing was a strategy that permitted Jewish families to attain and to strengthen their position in the American middle class. But that position came at psychological and communal cost. Um, so I'll talk more about that. I want to talk a little bit, I'll get to my arguments in a second, but I want to be able to talk a little bit more about my research, which is kind of a good sort of way that historians like to sort of prepare you and let you know exactly kind of the limits of what they've done, and that kind of, and the strategies that we use to sort of do our research, and that helps to sort of explain what I have found and then what I haven't found. And I'm happy to talk more during Q&A about the nature of my research, the process of my research, or any of those limitations. But I'm gonna alert you to a few of them right off the bat. So in my research, I examined, I'm sorry, I should be back here. I wanted to go back and look at this picture. I examined name change petitions filed with the city court of the city of New York from 1892 through 2012. And I'm happy to talk about this research, about the archives. I have some fun archive stories, as well as my methodology, trying to figure out who was Jewish and who was not in these city materials. Um, it is important to note that I did look at other resources, including the archives of Jewish organizations like the National Jewish Welfare Board, the American Jewish Congress. So these were large national Jewish organizations looking at the rest of the country. But the bulk of my findings about name changing were in New York City. Um, and this is partially because the records allowed me easy access, in a way that a lot of other cities, a lot of other places like Detroit, for example, would not. Um, so that's just one thing to get off the bat. I did not try all cities in the country, but I did try a few. And New York sort of allowed me special access. I don't know if anybody here is a genealogist, but I can talk a little bit more about searching for materials. They're not really set up for historians like me. And so I needed special access to be able to look at them in the way that I did. So I should also note that I chose New York City not only because of that access, but because I started this project 12 years ago, or actually, excuse me, 2007. So at this point, it's, oh my gosh, 17 years ago, a long time ago. I was at that time a young mother. I had a child in 2005. This would be the place where you could all say, "Oh, your kid's so cute." This is when he was 2 years old, and I'm from the New York area. And I was able to take him with me on my research trips. My mother and my mother-in-law were both able to watch him while I did my research. And that was really important to me because it did take an awfully long time to do this research, and I didn't want to be apart from my child. And then years later, I had a daughter. This is actually even 2 years earlier. So I brought her with me as well when I did my research. So this is partially just sort of tell you how long this process of research took, how many materials I looked through, and how many kind of practical questions needed to be addressed as I did the research. And as I say, I'm happy to talk more about this, but certainly both finding easy access and being able to be with my children while I did the research was an important part of the process. Um, I also want to say something about the research because of a lot of people's kind of expectations and assumptions about name changing. It's important to note that I am looking at formal legal name changing. Um, I use name change petitions, and that's a voluntary activity that I know differs greatly from many people's understandings of name changing, particularly if they have name changing stories in their families about Ellis Island. Many people believe that their names, their families' names were changed at Ellis Island when their ancestors entered the country. Um, Most immigration historians, most genealogists argue that this kind of like mass involuntary name changing taking place at Ellis Island simply did not take place. And this picture is kind of like a helpful way of thinking about this. If you look closely, and I can sort of use my cursor here to show a little bit what to look at. If you look closely, these Ellis Island officials are looking at these these notebooks, these large notebooks, which are actually ship manifests. If you're a genealogist, you may have looked at these. They are looking at these manifests, and if you can see, there's already writing on these manifests. They're not actually sitting and writing down. What they're doing actually is checking people's names against ship manifests that were prepared before the ship departed Europe. And so I'm going to go here. So what they are looking at is something that might look a little bit like this. This is a passenger list accessed at ancestry.com, which is something that, you know, people, you all can access yourselves. If you're a genealogist or have ever looked at your family history, you might have already looked at these. And you can see if you look at these materials that there are little check marks along the way, like there's little checks that the officials are using as they are calling people up. So they call people. There are translators at Ellis Island. There are translators there. They're calling up people's names, and then they're asking them questions and checking off elements of their identities as they move forward. Um, More importantly, immigrants did not leave Ellis Island with any paperwork that bound them to a new name. So Ellis Island officials there, when they're looking and checking off these manifests. They're not handing people new identity papers to take with them into the United States. Moreover, American law gave no power at all to inspectors to determine individuals' names. And in fact, it was against the rules at Ellis Island for them to do so. So it's certainly possible that a few rogue inspectors recommended to immigrants that they change their names. It's possible that they even wrote a name on immigrants' tags when they were detained at Ellis Island, because some people were detained at Ellis Island if they didn't have the proper paperwork, if there was a danger that they might be deported back home. It's possible that immigrants misunderstood these activities as the permanent acts of US government officials. All of these things are possible that happened on kind of an individual rogue basis, but there's little to no evidence that there was mass, systemic, involuntary name changing at Ellis Island. There is instead much more evidence of voluntary name changing in court and naturalization petitions throughout the country, like the documents that I showed you earlier, and like the documents that I looked at for this work. So historians generally need to look at documents or interview people, and I did do some interviews with people as well. But when you look at the documents, there's so many documents of actual voluntary name changing that's what I researched, and that's what I'm going to talk about, this voluntary official name changing. And I'm particularly going to talk about court petitions, mostly submitted by second generation Americans, rather than naturalization petitions, which were submitted by immigrants. 75% of the people who filled out the forms that I looked at were natural born Americans. So I'm happy to talk about this when we get to the end of the talk, but I just wanted to sort of, I like to try to make this up front to sort of help people think about sort of what I'm looking at, and I'm happy to answer questions about how I made these decisions and anything else. Okay, so let's go into the research. I broadly want to give you three arguments. So this talk is taken from two chapters of the book, and they're sort of some of the more fun ones, the more interesting ones. So you don't have to write this down. You're not a class, but I'm a professor, so I'm used to sort of giving people my arguments. And one of them I've already sort of offered for you in the beginning, that name changing reflects the complicated nature of American Jewish success. Jews were advancing in the middle class in the 1920s and the 1930s, but at the same time, growing anti-Semitism limited Jews' educational and economic opportunities in the 1920s and the 1930s. And anti-Semitism became a way of a strategy to address that anti-Semitism. The second argument I'm going to give is that name changing was not an individual act, and that I've already sort of hinted at, right? Name changing was not an individual act outside of the American Jewish community. It wasn't an effort to escape the American Jewish community. It was not something that was entered into by people who were, brushing the community away, doing this on their own, as an individual looking to kind of get out. Instead, it was a communal act. It was entered into by extended families, sometimes helped along by Jewish lawyers, other Jewish community members, and people are doing this together in a way that really I don't think has been appreciated or understood. And so although I'm looking at the 1920s and the 1930s as kind of the moment when this begins to explode, to develop as really a phenomenon of American Jewish life, I'm going to argue for you that World War II led to an explosion of Jews beginning this process of name changing, both because of a growth of bureaucracy, but also because of rising anti-Semitism during World War II. So those are going to be kind of the arguments that I'm going to offer for you. I want to sort of go a little bit to the files, and try to explain how I came to these arguments. So when I started looking in the files, I began seeing all these interesting patterns that I hadn't expected, and they kind of indicate some of the arguments that I developed. For one thing, during the years between World War I and World War II, New Yorkers began to file name change petitions in numbers that were double, triple, and quadruple those before the wars. And I began to wonder, like, why is that? Why do we see New Yorkers? Why is name changing going up so substantially during during this period between the wars? And so I'll argue for you to some extent that name changing was a byproduct of the growth of a modern state in the 20th century. So we see, and I've already sort of indicated, that there's memoirs and stories and novels that are filled with unofficial name changing. Immigrants chose new names quickly and easily without a second thought at the beginning of the 20th century. But as a growing government bureaucracy began to track individuals who needed to pay taxes, serve in the military, receive welfare benefits, names came to take on much more social, political, and economic significance. Ordinary people found it necessary to change their names officially, even if they had done so unofficially years before, which happened for a lot of people. They began changing their names officially in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s in order to receive benefits and avoid penalties, right? So the years between 1917 and 1945, a year of World War, depression, the growth of a welfare state, are moments, right, when the state is watching people, tracking people, offering them benefits, Social Security, right, welfare benefits, or penalties, right? Taxes, right? If you don't offer this information, if they can't track you successfully. So you see that with the growth of this modern state, we see a huge boom in name changing. And it's during those years that large numbers of Jews change their names. And another interesting pattern, so we see this large numbers of Jews, large numbers of people changing their names at this time. But it's also significantly, it is Jews who are changing their names disproportionate to their residents in New York City. It's well out of proportion to their actual numbers in the city. Between 1917 and 1942, the numbers of Jewish petitioners were roughly 50% of the total pool of name changers. And the Jewish population in New York City, even at this moment, even at its height, was roughly 25 to 30%. And so you can see it's about double the numbers of Jews who are actually living in the city are actually changing their names. And if you account for the fact that my numbers are predominantly people from Manhattan, it's even more disproportionate because it's only about 15% of Manhattan that is Jewish in the middle of the 20th century. And no other ethnic group came close to Jews' numbers in abandoning ethnic names during these years. In 1942, the total number of petitions submitted by people with Slavic, German, Italian, and Greek surnames, all people who were seeking to erase all of those different ethnic names, equaled altogether about one half of the Jewish populations named the Jewish petitions that are submitted for the same purposes. So we really do see this as kind of a Jewish phenomenon. And the presence of so many Jews illustrates the economic strength of Jews during the first part of the first part of the 20th century. Um, as I made clear, New York state law in the middle of the 20th century, maybe I haven't made this clear, but New York state law made clear that you did not have to file legal papers to change your name. You could do this unofficially. So if you filed an official petition, that signaled concern that someone would be or had been scrutinizing your name on paper. Um, and so, who's going to be looking at people's names on papers? Who's worried about having a Jewish name or having some kind of unusual name on paper? It is mostly people at that time, it's mostly people in the middle class. It was expensive to change your name officially. It cost money to file a petition. You had to hire a lawyer. And you also had to put an announcement in the newspaper advertising the change. That was a part of the law, the requirement of the law. And so all of those things cost money. And so people who have the most money are going to be most able to do this. But more subtly and more significantly, in the first half of the 20th century, it was primarily white collar workers and businessmen who worried that someone might be scrutinizing their names. And that's a little hard for us to understand. We're used to any kind of job. My kid wants a job, waiting tables. My kid wants a job. Even doing lawn work, sometimes you have to, go fill out a form, right? In these days, working class jobs, domestic service, loading cargo, union jobs, right, in factories were frequently given to individuals based on word of mouth or based on an appraisal of their bodies, right? People would go to a street corner and they would be selected for a job. They wouldn't use names on job applications. That's a lot of working class jobs at that moment. The need to change one's name officially in the first half of the 20th century was primarily a white collar need. A businessman's need to attract customers, a student's need to get into professional school, a secretary's need to impress a potential employer. Jews' unusual position among immigrants, having moved in large numbers from blue collar to white collar work by the time of the Depression, made them the recent immigrant group with the most money available for filing name change petitions, and more importantly, the group most concerned about their name's appearance on paper. At the same time, however, the fact that roughly 50% of name change petitioners were Jewish in the 1930s and the 1940s strongly suggests that pervasive anti Semitism was limiting Jewish opportunities for employment. Um, and so I'm going to show a few pieces of evidence that kind of indicate for us the ways that that anti-Semitism limited Jews' employment and turned name changing into a strategy for middle class success. Um, so as we see more Jews entering white collar work, they are finding increasing barriers to their employment. According to one 1937 report, 89% of large New York firms declared that they, quote, preferred Christians as employees. Employment advertisements throughout the 1930s, as you can see on this image, were increasingly noting that employers were Christian or Anglo-Saxon firms, or that they wanted Christians or Protestants. So you can see if you look here, and I don't know I don't know how well you can see the fine print, but if you look, statisticians are required to be Protestants. College grads are asked to be Protestant. Even security guards and floormen, which are more working class jobs, are required to be Christian. And this is open, this is above board, this is legal, right? This is happening in a newspaper with no protests. People perceive no legal recourse to this kind of discrimination. And employers at this time routinely used names as markers to identify and exclude Jews. Journalists in the 1930s, for example, reported that employment agencies and employers regularly turned away individuals with Jewish sounding names, right? So if you think, how do they know who's Protestant and Christian? They are frequently using names as one of their key markers. Distinctive Jewish names are the key markers to determine who gets an interview or not. And petition, oh, and we can also see this being illustrated through education as well. So we can see I've used John F. Kennedy's application to Harvard University as an illustration of this. We also see universities like Columbia and Harvard, beginning in 1917 and 1918, begin to change their application process, begin to impose quotas on potential Jewish applicants. And they create application forms that go from being half a page to being, pages and pages long, um, and that ask questions like, where and when was your father born? Has your father been naturalized? What's your father's occupation? What's your mother's maiden name in full? I don't know if you can read that, but that is one of the questions that John F. Kennedy had to answer. And that was indeed not only because the college was trying to figure out who was Jewish by using all this genealogical information of where and when your father was born, naturalized, all this kind of stuff, but is also trying to identify the mother, right? Because there is an assumption already that Jews are changing their names. And so using the mother's maiden name and asking about that in an application form was actually a way to try to limit or eliminate Jews from the application pool, or to limit them in being admitted. Um, and petition after petition that I found in the archives described troubles seeking work and hinted, although did not fully indict, the forces of anti-Semitism that were making it impossible for them to find jobs. So, for example, Dora Sarietsky, who was a stenographer and a typist, testified in 1937, or put in her petition in 1937, that her name proved to be a great handicap in securing a position. In order to facilitate securing work, I assumed the name Doris Watson. And those ellipses, the dots in there that I put there, that actually just encapsulates the description of all the places she went to and couldn't find a job because her name was Sorietsky, right? And you see, she takes the name unofficially, but then by 1937 feels the need to ask for this name to be official. Um, Similarly, Bertram Levy in 1932 was a salesman, and he similarly testified that his name has been a hindrance to him in his efforts to gain an entrance to various firms and to secure business from them. And this is a common pattern, even as these people are not saying this is anti-Semitism, they are describing that, when they went to look for jobs using their names, which were Jewishly identified names or sounded like Jewish names, they were denied work. A few of the petitions that I found in the New York City Civil Court did speak openly of anti-Semitism. An engineer named Julius Kaminsky, for example, in 1932, petitioned the court to allow him to change his name to George Joseph Cayley. He said, because although he was a Hungarian Roman Catholic, he insisted, he had this Jewish name. Employers consistently assumed he was a Jew, and that made it hard for him to keep a job, or to get a job, I should say. While petitioner has the highest of respect for people of the Jewish race, he said, he finds that other people in the city of New York have not that respect, and that a good many employers under whom he has worked have discriminated against the Jewish race. So clearly here he's indicating although he says he's Roman Catholic, he is noting that he is experiencing anti-Semitism because of his name. The same thing was true for a petitioner named Leo Goldkopf, who wrote, I have had many opportunities on, and he too indicated that he was a Catholic. I have had many opportunities of obtaining employment in organizations where Christians were preferred, but my name precluded favorable consideration of my application. Upon occasions, friends of mine declined to give me a written recommendation solely on the ground that my name would make it impossible to obtain the position in question. So Kaminsky and Goldkopf's petitions, I think, shed a powerful light on the veil of anti-Semitism that shrouded many Jews' efforts to find jobs and integrate into the military. I'll talk about that in a second. In the 1930s, Jews, I think, were in general more reticent to talk about their experiences, and it's pretty interesting to me that it is Christians, people who self-identified as Christians, who identified that they were experiencing anti-Semitism. And I think, and I can talk later about what this means about anti-Semitism in the United States, but I think it's significant to sort of understand this. Okay, sorry, let me get to the, oh, sorry, I'm having trouble with my thing. There we go. Excuse me. Oh, actually, before I get to that, I'm sorry. Sorry, I want to go back for a second. Um, I'll note that, in sort of talking about this a little more, I'll note that many name change petitioners, excuse me, used formulas such as employers found my name difficult to pronounce, spell, and remember, even when their name was pronounced and spelled phonetically. For example, the case of housewife Rose Lefkowitz, who changed her name to Rose Linford because her name was difficult to pronounce. Note, Lefkowitz is not particularly difficult to pronounce. Others, like Max Greenberger, called their names foreign sounding or asked the court to grant them permission to use an American name. Um, and it's true that this language was generally constructed by lawyers rather than individual petitioners. It was designed to appeal to judges, and there was some anxiety about judges sort of rejecting the possibility of anti-Semitism. But I think it is really important to note that large numbers of Jewish men and women use this vague terminology of foreign or difficult to pronounce, while Catholic men were much more comfortable detailing the specific discrimination that they had experienced, which again suggests that Jews were uncomfortable talking about anti-Semitism and were perhaps ashamed of their experiences with discrimination. And I can talk more about what I think this means or why it's significant at the end of the talk if you're interested. Um, so this is a bar graph to show you, to sort of really visually illustrate what my petitions looked like throughout the course of the 20th century. And you can see that the numbers go way, way up in 1942. And they go up even further actually in 1946, I'll say. World War II really intensified the trend of name changing that had begun to go up during and after World War I. The numbers of New Yorkers officially changing their names began to double in 1940 and then skyrocketed during the years of World War II, reaching a peak of 1,127 in 1946, 4 times the average of the previous decade, and the largest number of name change petitions in 1 year in Manhattan throughout the 20th century. So, why did Jewish name changing rise so exponentially during World War II? Well, one reason is probably, as I sort of indicated before, the growth of government and bureaucracy. The growth of the state during World War II correlated with a rise in government concern over individuals' names. Ordinary individuals increasingly found it necessary or desirable to change their names officially in order to apply for officer training or to find a job in the defense industry, right? If they wanted any of these things, they ran up against actually bureaucratic requirements that they produce a birth certificate. And when the name on the birth certificate was different from the name on their application form, they ran into trouble. So we can see the bureaucracy of World War II directing individuals' attention to names much more intensely than it had before. And I think I have some petitions here that can show us this. So Saul Jack Kaufman, in his petition to change his name to Jack Kay, says, in view of the fact that I intend to register on February 16th, 1942 for selective service, I do not wish there to be any confusion with respect to my identity. Laura Ginsburg notes that she has been a secretary working for the US government for 7 years. She's been known by Laura Gale. She is about to apply, she's been working as a secretary. She's about to apply for employment by the US government, and that application had to be accompanied by a birth certificate, right? So people are indicating that bureaucracy is limiting their abilities to get jobs. But I would argue that bureaucracy is not the whole story. The large numbers of Jews applying to change their names during the war suggest that there are other forces of nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism. And I'll say this might seem surprising to anyone who has seen a World War II movie, right? The US government took pains during the war to emphasize that individuals with different foreign sounding names, including Jewish names, were patriots, right? Fighting the war together. I don't know, maybe I'm laughing at this. Maybe nobody here has seen a World War II movie. I watched them with my father when I was a kid. This is, Bataan. From 1943, but films like Bataan, Action in the North Atlantic, Objective Burma, Purple Heart, all tons of these World War II movies emphasize the varied ethnic names of male soldiers. They had to have a platoon that had all kinds of different ethnic names. So Alfred Rosenthal, Antonio Batoya, and William Schick would all be members of the same battalion, right? In these kind of fictional film representations. And this was intentional. It was intentional on part of the filmmakers to establish the democratic credentials of the nation's fighting forces and the democracy of the nation itself. Um, and these multi-ethnic platoons were designed by filmmakers and required. These were required by the Office of War Information. They're actually sort of the rules require filmmakers to do this to kind of pass muster, um, to show the ways that the nation was made stronger by its reliance on many different men from a wide range of ethnic backgrounds, all committed to the common cause of democracy, all supported by official policies of tolerance. And Jews from Brooklyn like show up in every single one of these platoons, right? Um, but ironically, at the same time, diverse names, came to symbolize intolerance in America during World War II. And I apologize, I don't know if you can hear that. There's some construction going on outside my window. Can people still hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up if that's okay? Can you all still hear? Okay. Sorry about that. It should go soon. Poems, songs, and slurs that were repeated constantly in the 1940s relied on sounded a bit like this. Let me give you an example. The first American. Um, let's see. Um, First American killed in Pearl Harbor, John J. Hennessy. First pilot, and excuses for the anti-Asian racism of this era. First pilot to sink a Japanese ship, Colin P. Kelly. First American to sink a Japanese ship with a torpedo, John P. Buckley. Greatest American air hero, Butch O'Hare. First American killed at Guadalcanal, John J. O'Brien. First American to get 4 new tires, Abraham Lipschitz. Um, so um, Poems, songs, slurs that were repeated constantly. And sometimes when I show this in a group, I do get laughs. People laugh at this, right? And it's funny, right? And the humor relies on the Jewish name at the end. So this poem took on many different. Names. It wasn't always John Buckley or Colin Kelly. But all the beginning of the poem is all acts of heroism. All the names committing these acts of heroism are all English or Irish or German names. And then the last name is always the act of a war profiteer. And it is always an identifiably Jewish name. And they used these Jewish names for their humor, right? They're funny names, and funny, and that is associated with kind of some anti-Semitic beliefs about who Jews are. And they are inherently labeling the possessor of these Jewish names cowardly, greedy, calculating in their willingness to escape military service, and sometimes even a desire to control the country. And these were widespread. This poem was found, in defense plant newspapers. It was found on subway cars. It was found in soldiers' letters being sent back home. This was really common. Um, so this is not the only one. This is the most common of them. This is the most popular, but there are actually lots and lots of sort of circulating poems and songs and things that use Jewish names as slurs that are being widely circulated in the US and particularly in military circles, that Jewish officers, Jewish soldiers, and Jewish workers are seeing on a regular basis. And this, I think, it formed the context for Jews to be changing their names in such high numbers during World War II. Jews, again, in their name change petitions, did not dwell on their experiences with anti-Semitism, preferring again to focus on the foreignness of their names, or sometimes, as we see during the war, describing their names as handicaps or impediments. So, for example, Solomon Goldfarb, in his petition to change his name to Saul Robert Guilford, he was an engineer, explained that his name was a handicap. I desire that any offspring of my marriage shall not labor under the handicap of going through life with a name such as Goldfarb. This is an unfortunate situation in the world we live in, but it is a situation not of my making, and I feel that we must face reality. Eugene Martin Greenberg in 1942 changed his name because he said he was just about to register for the military. And while with US military forces, his career will be more successful, and he may ultimately secure merited advancement on legal assumption of said proposed surname. Many Jews were convinced that they would either experience active anti-Semitism in the form of slurs or violence from their fellow soldiers, but also that they would not be able to advance anywhere if they were seen as being Jewish. By the end of the war, 1946, 30% of name changers were veterans, and another 10% were their wives. So fully 40% of the people changing their names in 1946, again, the year with the highest number of name changes in the entire 20th century, 40% of those name changers are Jews, are veterans or their wives with Jewish names. So name change petitions, I think, offer us uncomfortable evidence of the ways that ethnic difference, particularly Jewish difference, engendered so much prejudice during World War II that Americans worked to erase their difference utterly and shed any vestiges of their background or their past. So here are some conclusions I'd like to leave you with. And one of them is, that name changing is not a joke. It's been a significant part of American Jewish life. Name changing has shaped American Jewish life more than scholars have typically acknowledged. And then I didn't write it down, but I'll say name changing was not an individual act. It was a group act. We see all of these families, immediate and extended families, changing their names. They are upwardly mobile, and that's the reason they're changing their names. And rather than alleviating anti-Semitism in the United States, as some people have argued, even after the war in 1946, I'd argue for you that World War II intensified anti-Semitism. So thank you for coming. I have another cute picture of my children on the beach. And I look forward to any questions that you all have. I'll stop my share.
Right. So why don't you, there you go. Are there any quick questions?
I think name changing, Jewish name changing, is not just an American phenomenon. And I'll give you an example, which is kind of funny. This is my sister's husband's family. Okay, so in Europe, I don't know where they were from. They were either from near the Ukraine, I don't know, they were in Belarus, near Belarus, or somewhere in what's now the Ukraine. I don't know where they came from. So the first member of this large extended family went to France, and he wanted to sound French. So he changed the last name from Ananovich to Arnaud, and he wanted to sound French, and he spelt it incorrectly, not the French way. Okay. Then he, I think this is the order, then he moved to Italy, where he married an Italian woman, and he again wanted to sound Italian, so he changed the name to Arnuli. Okay. The rest of the family, or part of the rest of the family, came to the United States, and they kept the name Arnaud, the one that he had taken in France. So there are all these American Arnautoviches that are Arnaud. But the grandparents that were still in Europe, in Ukraine or wherever they're from, and their children those children that hadn't immigrated yet, they ended up going to Argentina, where they did not change the name. So there are a lot of Ananovitches that live in Buenos Aires, and they're Arnauds and the Ananovitches, and I don't know if there are any Anulis still left.
Interesting. Any other?
Oh,
Go,
can I
go
just
ahead, Kirsten.
respond to that quickly? So thank you so much for this story. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's great. It's rare to see it in so many different places, right? But absolutely, you are correct. And this is very careful. I'm an American historian. I'm not an historian. There is absolutely name changing in other parts of the world, but I think there's very little study. There's been one book on French name changing. There's been a book on Russian name changing. Israeli name changing, there's not been a book on or any significant articles that I know of, but I've talked with some Israeli historians. There are some really interesting parallels between American and Israeli name changing. So you're absolutely right that this English name, there's name changing all over the world. I am an American historian, so I looked at American name changing. I would argue that at least in American in England, it's one of the more, there are some of the more flexible places in the entire world to be able to change your name. So a lot of European nations were more restrictive, and so I think you can see really interesting things out of the name changing of the United States. But absolutely, I would love it if more scholars would do more work on names that could make it more comparative, I think, because I think that's a really great point. So thank you.
You might find my background interesting. I was born in Hungary. My parents, my father had a very Jewish name, Shmuel Adler. And when my mother got married, my mother, this was already in communist Hungary. So my mother decided that this name she cannot tolerate because of being so Jewish. So I don't know how my father actually agreed to this, but she decided to select an Hungarian actor's name and change the name to a very Hungarian name. For the interest, it's Ajtai, pronounced Ajtai. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, we immigrated to the United States in 1970. I was in high school, and I registered in high school with my name, which was George, the Hungarian version of George Ajtai. In 3 days, I figured out that no teacher is going to be able to pronounce my name. Okay, so kind of interest. It's kind of, there is a little bit of a conclusion to this. So I went to my father. I said, I can't live with this name. So he said, well, why don't you take on our original family name, which was Adler. So, and I started using the name Adler. By the time I ended up going to college, I was panicking because I was getting my diploma with the Adler name, and officially, I had absolutely no record of Adler as being American accepted. So I told my father we need to change the name, and so we ended up going to a lawyer. We paid a nice fee, I remember. We did publish in the papers. I still have the original statement, and we officially changed the name to Adler. Now, in your perspective, this was in the 70s, so we did not have any worry about being anti-Semitic. Being Adler is not really that Jewish of a name, for one, and I never even thought that this would have an effect. But I think the 70s, in the United States, there wasn't that much of if you measure anti-Semitism, probably there weren't that much.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a fascinating story. And I had been wondering about the time frame. So I really appreciate your sort of saying that. And yeah, name changing really declined among Jews in the 1970s. So I see very little of it in the petitions. But it is true that people, and very, very few among Jews, you do see still people sometimes who are immigrants who are sort of concerned about sort of, the sound of the name, but frequently not even Jewish names. So yeah, that is a really fascinating story, but less common certainly during that era. But it's really, really interesting.
So,
Thank you so much.
60 years ago in South Africa, I heard the Sean Ferguson story told as a joke. I'm wondering how many Sean Fergusons there are in the world.
And the question is how many Jewish Sean Fergusons there are. My really fascination about that joke is actually in the 5th chapter of my book. I tried to go back and do some research to find out how old that joke is. And it actually is a post-65 joke. It's like a post-70s joke, really. Like beforehand, I actually found a version of that joke in like the late 1960s being told as like a Hollywood joke. It's like a Jewish guy gets on the train and goes to Hollywood because he's an actor. He's a Yiddish actor. And his agent has given him a new name and he's practicing it on the train. And he gets to Hollywood and he gets an audition with the director. And the director, he says, Shane Ferguson. And the guy says, Sean Ferguson. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit, I don't think there are many, right? I think it's a joke. It's an old wives' tale. And it's a more recent vintage than I think we think. So thank you for telling me that.
Wasn't changed, right? I mean, Fermaglich.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. I didn't hear the first part of what you said.
In your book, I think you joked a little bit about with your name, Fermaglich, why that wasn't changed.
Well, yeah. So the interesting thing, I never changed my own name. That is my name. I actually didn't take my husband's name. Not necessarily because of any of this, but actually, I don't get into the details. My family name is like Vermöglich, with a V and an O for an umlaut, right? So there are people of my branch who kept the Fermaglich spelling, and then I don't think that, and then there are people who changed their name to Firm. So we have family members who've changed their names to Firm. I've given this public talk and had people who knew my cousins named Firm in the audience, actually, which was really cool. But yeah, no, I didn't choose to change my name, but it doesn't reflect any judgment. I mean, I think one of the most important things about my work that is very, very important, if there's any message for me and anything that was really important to me, is not to judge name changing. A lot of the second part of my book sort of talks about people in the Jewish community kind of judging name changers in varieties of ways after World War II. And yeah, it's really important to me to try not to judge people, or to at least understand the context in which people changed their names, and to understand kind of why people did it and what kind of pressures they were facing. However, yeah, I didn't choose to change my name because I got used to it, and probably feelings about that.
On behalf of our Hazak program, thank you so much for joining us by Zoom from Michigan, so we could have you talking with us about a fascinating topic today. Thank you very, very much.
No problem. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye. Okay.